Why did ancient generals often live longer than the soldiers they commanded? After all, they too rode onto battlefields, faced the clash of steel, and risked their lives on the same bloody ground. Shouldn't they have fallen just as quickly as the men in the front ranks? Legends give one answer. They describe the general as a larger-than-life warrior, part hero, part demigod, part action star. In epic tales and modern films, he charges into enemy lines, cutting through soldiers as if they were straw, leaping walls, and somehow surviving what would kill hundreds of ordinary men. It is an image both thrilling and comforting. If the general outlived his troops, it must have been because he was stronger, braver, chosen by destiny itself. This version of history makes war look less cruel, as if survival were always a reward for greatness. But reality, of course, was far less cinematic. The truth of why battlefield commanders lived longer is not a single story, but a tangle of reasons. Some practical, some strategic, and some whispered bitterly by the very men who died protecting them. To uncover it, we must move past the myths. Step by step, through dust and blood, we will peel back the layers. Only then will we see why the banner of the commander so often remained standing, while the ranks beneath it turned red and silent. If one wishes to understand why ancient generals lived longer, it helps to start not with legends, but with numbers. War, for all its chaos, had its own kind of brutal arithmetic. Picture an ancient battlefield. 10,000 soldiers stand shoulder to shoulder, shields raised, spears braced, hearts pounding in unison. When the arrows fly, they do not choose their targets by rank. They fall where the formation is thickest. And who is standing there, shoulder to shoulder in the front row? Not the general. It is the ordinary foot soldier, the man with no title, no special armor, no protective circle of guards. Commanders, by contrast, occupied a very different place in the formation. They were positioned behind multiple layers of troops, usually in the center or rear, where they could see the field and issue orders. To reach a general, an enemy force first had to cut through rows of infantry, waves of cavalry, and sometimes even fortifications built to shield command. It was like trying to reach the core of an onion. The outer layers had to be peeled away first, and those outer layers were made of human lives. This was not cowardice, it was necessity. A commander was not only a warrior, he was the mind of the army. If he fell too quickly, the chain of command collapsed, and the soldiers, no matter how brave, could descend into chaos. Protecting the general was as much about strategy as about survival. Armies invested heavily in keeping him alive because an army without a leader was little more than a panicked crowd with weapons. The difference in survival then often came down to probability. Imagine a storm of arrows descending. A soldier in the front rank had a 1 in 3 chance of being hit. A soldier in the middle ranks had a 1 in 5 chance. The commander, standing far behind and shielded by elite guards, had a 1 in 20 chance or less. Over dozens of battles, those percentages made the difference between being remembered as a name in stone or disappearing nameless in the dirt. Of course, from a soldier's perspective, this arrangement could feel unfair. He was the one catching arrows, while the general was the one catching glory. Yet even soldiers understood that if the commander survived, there was at least a chance to regroup, to retreat, or even to win. If the commander died, all bets were off. So, the first great secret of why generals lived longer was not martial arts, not divine favor, but something much simpler. They were not standing where the killing was heaviest. And in war, sometimes survival is nothing more than being in the right, or rather, the least deadly place at the right time. Another reason ancient generals survived longer was not mystical at all. It was material. Simply put, they had better gear, better food, and better care. And in a world where survival was often decided by inches of iron and ounces of strength, these details mattered. Start with armor. The average foot soldier might march into battle with a wooden shield, a leather cap, and perhaps a breastplate, if his commander's budget allowed it. Many fought with nothing more than padded cloth and faith. An ancient general, on the other hand, wore iron or steel plates forged by the best craftsmen his treasury could afford. His helmet was sturdy, his chest well protected, and his horse often draped in armor of its own. When arrows rained down, a soldier prayed not to be hit. A commander prayed too, but if struck, his armor gave him a much better chance of standing up again. Then there was the matter of weapons. A farmer-turned-soldier might be issued a spear so roughly made that it splintered after the first clash. A general carried a sword of superior steel, sharpened, balanced, sometimes even decorated. Now, decoration does not stop an enemy blade, but quality does. A well-made weapon meant fewer accidents, more confidence, and yes, a better chance of surviving the chaos. Food and health were no less important. Soldiers often ate stale bread, thin gruel, or whatever they could forage from the countryside. Generals dined on fresh meat, wine, and provisions carried in special wagons. They were better fed, better rested, and less likely to collapse from exhaustion before the enemy even arrived. One could joke that sometimes the first man to die in a battle wasn't the one struck by a sword, but the one who fainted from hunger. And what happened after the battle was just as critical. If a soldier was wounded, he might receive a rag, a prayer, and, if lucky, a crude bandage. More often, he was left where he fell. A commander, however, was rushed to the medics, treated with rare herbs, stitched carefully, and guarded until recovery. In many armies, the death of a general was a disaster worth any cost to prevent. The death of a soldier was, tragically, just another number in the tally. These differences compounded over time. Better armor meant fewer fatal wounds. Better food meant stronger bodies. Better medical care meant injuries that killed a soldier could be survived by a commander. Over years of campaigning, such advantages stacked like coins in a chest, making the life of a general far more durable than that of his men. It is tempting to say that generals lived longer because they were better fighters. The truth is less romantic. They lived longer because they were better supplied. And in war, the man with thicker armor, a sharper sword, a full stomach, and a personal doctor has a very obvious advantage over the man with nothing but a spear and hope. If armor and position kept ancient generals alive physically, strategy and psychology kept them alive politically. In any army, the commander was more than a man. He was a symbol. And symbols, once broken, could shatter an entire force. Consider the chaos of battle. Drums thunder, horns blare, dust clouds blur vision. Soldiers can barely hear their own breath, let alone orders. In this storm of noise and fear, one steady point gives direction: the figure of the commander, standing tall beneath his banner. If that banner fell, morale often collapsed with it. Soldiers might still be armed, but without belief, they fought like men already defeated. On the other hand, as long as the general lived, hope lived. Even if half the army was gone, even if the enemy pressed hard, the presence of the commander gave the illusion of order, and sometimes illusions were enough to keep men fighting. This is why commanders were surrounded by elite guards, often the best-trained warriors in the army. Their mission was singular and absolute: protect the general. Some armies even rotated guards in shifts, so that the commander was always encircled by men ready to die for him. To lose the general was to risk losing the entire army. To lose a soldier, though tragic, did not have the same catastrophic effect. It was also a matter of communication. Generals carried not only swords, but strategies. They were the ones who knew when to feign retreat, when to spring an ambush, when to send cavalry racing around the flank. Without them, orders dissolved into confusion. Picture 10,000 men all asking the same question. Now what? That is not an army. That is a mob with sharp sticks. So while movies may show the general charging alone into the thick of battle, the truth is that his most important weapon was not his sword, but his survival itself. As long as he lived, the army had meaning. As long as his banner flew, the army had a reason to stand. Stories love heroes, and history, when retold around fires or on movie screens, has a way of polishing reality until it shines like legend. Ancient generals, of course, make perfect candidates for this treatment. A soldier's tale is tragic, but often anonymous. A general's tale, however, can be shaped into the myth of an invincible warrior, a man who charges alone into the fray, scattering enemies like autumn leaves. In legend, the general is always the strongest fighter, the one who can duel 10 men at once, the one who turns the tide with a single swing of his sword. He is the embodiment of courage, skill, and destiny. And, in fairness, many commanders were skilled warriors. Some truly did fight bravely in the front lines when circumstances demanded it, but here lies the difference. Those moments were exceptions, not the rule. A commander who constantly behaved like a movie hero did not remain a commander for long. If he survived the enemy, he risked being undone by his own poor decisions. Armies needed leaders who could think, command, and endure, not merely slash their way through chaos. Reality, then, was far colder and more practical. Generals lived longer because they had layers of protection, better equipment, stronger horses, better food, and medical attention. They survived because soldiers stood in front of them, absorbing the danger first. They survived because their deaths were simply too costly to accept, while the deaths of ordinary men were treated as inevitable. It is not a pleasant truth, but it is the truth. And yet, perhaps it is human nature to prefer the legend. To imagine the general as a larger-than-life hero is comforting. It gives meaning to sacrifice, makes the battlefield feel less cruel, and offers audiences a story worth retelling. After all, no one goes to the theater hoping to see 2 hours of logistics, ration distribution, and the mathematics of probability. People want the soaring sword fights, the one man against 1,000, the leap over the wall, the impossible survival. So we are left with 2 versions of the same figure. In the movies, the general is immortal because of skill. In reality, the commander lived longer because of systems built to protect him. Between legend and fact lies the truth. Generals were men, not gods, and their survival was engineered, not magical. In the end, the question of why ancient generals lived longer than their soldiers does not require magic to answer. It requires only an honest look at the structure of war itself. Generals survived because they were shielded by numbers, by equipment, by medicine, and by the system that declared their lives more valuable than the lives of ordinary men. They did not leap over walls in slow motion or cut down hundreds of enemies with a single swing. Those images belong to legends and films, not to history. What history shows is more sobering. Survival in war was rarely about individual skill alone. It was about where one stood, what one wore, and who was willing to die first. For the soldier, this reality was bitter. His death was expected, his name easily forgotten. For the commander, survival was engineered, planned, resourced, protected, because his loss could mean the collapse of the entire army. The battlefield was not fair, and it was never meant to be. Yet, even as we strip away the myths, one truth remains. Both commanders and soldiers faced war together. Both risked their lives, though the odds were uneven. The soldier's sacrifice was the shield behind the commander's survival, and the commander's survival gave purpose, however fragile, to the sacrifice of the soldier. So when we ask, why did generals live longer than soldiers? The answer is simple. Not because of mystical skill, not because of divine blessing, but because war itself was designed to keep them alive. And that design, though cruel, is what carved their names into stone, while the soldiers who held the line remain carved only into the silent earth.